What's going on, y'all? Today we are talking about Saudi Arabia acquiring EA for $55 billion. That is a lot of money. And it raises the question for me immediately, why does Saudi Arabia want EA of all things? Let's get into it. Now, to give a little context, Saudi Arabia has been dabbling, or maybe I shouldn't say dabbling, but has been investing in like the esports world of gaming for maybe a few years now, maybe longer. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I was looking at this article provided by LA Times. And at this point, when is this article dated? This is as of June 9th. Now, they're saying that Savvy, hold on. Oh, yeah. That Savvy Games Group, which is a company owned by the Public Investment Fund, which is Saudi Arabia's $700 billion flagship sovereign fund, which I guess is just like a big company in Saudi Arabia, if you need some translation there. And they have roughly acquired 40% of the global esports industry, which I did not realize that. I've seen headlines of them investing in things like Fortnite, and I know they've been hosting a lot of events and things like that over there. I didn't realize 40%, that's a lot. You know, it's literally almost half. And as you can see on screen, if you've been reading it, it says that it is about the gaming equivalent of the NFL. That is a large amount. I really did not. 40% is a lot. So now we have some context. Let's kind of piggyback or double back to the whole, why does Saudi Arabia want to own EA? And that's not to say that EA is necessarily a terrible, entity from start to finish. There was a period of time where EA was doing great things, things like Dead Space, the initial release of their sports games. There's been other franchises I can't think of at the moment. And currently, Battlefield is probably one of the, franchises where 3 and 4 were strong, a little murky in between, and now 6 is really kind of surging, especially with Black Ops 7 not being so great. So it just kind of makes you wonder, why would they invest $55 billion into EA? And I wonder if it's to get their foot in the door a different way, because I was researching like Saudi Arabia and games they've made. And I mean, it says, Google and the internet says that they've made games. Nothing that I've ever seen before. Maybe is local stuff that just never made it overseas to us, which I guess can kind of tell you how good those games are, in my humble opinion. So maybe this was a way to acquisition all of the studios that EA has absorbed over time. But to be fair, EA typically when they buy a studio, they take all the talent, they take all the people for whatever it is they actually want. Then they dissolve the studio. So they're indirectly, hiring reliable people who know what they're doing in gaming, in a sense, something like that. And now Saudi Arabia is reaping the benefit of all those people, those employees. Now, technically, the deal and all that stuff won't even start to affect gamers until 2026. So for the next year or so, everything is going to be the same while they work on all the merging and etc. Sorry, just checking something on another screen. And we won't start to see those effects until 2026, when the deal should be going through in 2027. But, I guess my question is Saudi Arabia looking to try to make games? Maybe they want to create the ideal game that represents Saudi Arabia, where they can create an esport out of a game that they've made, versus having to make esports teams and work around existing games, which mostly come from America. So I could kind of see that, they're trying to buy all the pieces in the gaming process, and have complete control over a specific game and esports organization, to where, let's say they come out with this cool game. Let's just say some kind of FIFA soccer. I know soccer is a big thing over there. It's a big thing for actually quite a few people on the other side of the world, outside of the US. But I guess you could look at it from that perspective, where, like I said, they're trying to own all the pieces, right? So they create the cool game that everybody wants to play. They set up an esports, I can't say they set up an esports, they're going to have a team, right? But maybe they set up this kind of system where, if you want to get in on this esports thing, then your esports team has to pay to get into it, which doesn't sound great. But if it's a really popular game and people want to see it, the organizations with the most money will probably just buy into it for the exposure that comes with that, to keep their, the esports scene alive, while the smaller teams get phased out. That's very possible. I mean, it sounds terrible. Who in their right mind would do that? But once people with money start to buy into it, you kind of feel like you have to, or you get phased out. It's imagine a new Call of Duty comes out next year, and instead of paying $70, you could pay $70 to get the base game, but if you want the multiplayer, you got to pay $30 extra for it. And of course, that sounds terrible right out the gate, but I guarantee you, people who have money and money's is kind of maybe not an object to them, but you know, they could afford $30 more for multiplayer or whatever, then they will do that. And then all of a sudden you have content creators and all these organizations jumping in on it because, you know, it's a hot commodity. People want to see it. Well, now everyone else kind of follows suit and it kind of becomes the norm. You kind of see how that works where like, even though something's a bad idea, if other people buy into it, well, then it kind of feels like you have to, or you get left out, you lose exposure, you miss out on money, you start to get phased out. And then all the other companies start doing the same thing. You know, so like that's a bit of a tangent, but like that's something that could happen in the future where, you know, now that Saudi Arabia has the means to make their own games, especially to the, you know, tailoring them to the American hemisphere, I guess you could say culture or whatever you want to say, you know, because EA has been making games with primarily an American target audience because that's where a lot of gaming income comes from. You know, you take that group of people who know how to make those type of games. Now you kind of tailor a little bit to the, you know, Saudi Arabian people, but you still maintain that American audience. Now you create a gym and then all the pieces start to fall into place to where now people are buying into Saudi Arabia. They can push their own, you know, merch, etc. And you know what I'm saying? Like it all kind of falls into place where like now they have their own system that people have to buy into if they want to be a part of it, and people are going to do that. So that's an interesting take. Now I don't know if that's what they're doing. I've seen things where the internet is suggesting that they're trying to take eyes off of other issues that are happening in the country, but I've also seen things where they talk about, sorry, I'm just looking at another screen, where they talk about that the country is just looking for other ways to expand their money outside of being a primarily oil country, which, you know, could be foreshadowing to maybe oil may not be a big thing in the future. I would argue that it's going to be for quite a while, but, you know, it doesn't hurt to have a plan B, you know, if there is a big shift away from oil, which again, I don't see that happening, but I mean, maybe they know something I don't. Obviously they have $55 billion. They're clearly doing things that I'm not doing. So, but yeah, you know, so like there's a couple of things floating there, but I would think that's the end game. I've worked for Fortune 500 companies, do IT, I do my research, and I have seen that the ideal process, and this is just like a little history lesson going back in time. I don't remember the exact name. Let me hit the pause here, but I'm thinking Vanderbilt's, and how they owned every step of the process when it came to manufacturing. I don't know if it was railroad equipment where they owned every bit of the process, but it made them so much more money. Yeah, they had to pay up front to get that stuff in place, but once they had it, they didn't have to pay somebody to go make, you know, said product. They didn't have to pay somebody to transport it because they owned all of that stuff. So let me double check that really quick. So I looked it up, and Vanderbilt was more horizontal, meaning they bought up their competitors to create a monopoly, where again, vertical is when you buy all the steps to make your said product. And again, that's what it looks like is happening. This is a Hail Mary approach theory that I have, that Saudi Arabia, since they have a 40% presence in the esports space, it only makes sense that they start producing games to help bolster their esports presence. You know, they have the team, but they don't necessarily have like the sport. I mean, which they do, right? There are games coming out, but I'm sure that they would want to make more games to continue to keep making esports teams and probably continue to eat up the esports space. And then that would be like, again, their plan B, or just like something that synergizes, or not synergizes, but works alongside the oil industry that they have going on. So I think that's kind of where I'm at. Another thing I wanted to touch on outside of that was just that who was a part of that deal, and that was Donald Trump's son, Jared Kushner. I could not remember the name to save my life. Now, I've seen a lot of people complaining about the deal and how like they won't be getting Battlefield 6 and things like that because of this deal with Saudi Arabia. And I think this might be one of the pieces that is keeping people from buying it, which is the Jared Kushner part. But it does make me wonder, you know, I've already talked about how Saudi Arabia could be essentially doing, can I pause this? Because moving right here is annoying me. But anyway, you know, we already talked about them, you know, setting up their process to create games in the esports space they have 40% of. But another thing to think about is like outside of esports games, surely they'll make some single player stuff, right? And if they don't, it does make me curious as to like what games the studios will be making underneath this Saudi Arabian / Kushner deal. You know what I mean? Like, people always complain about not having politics in games, but clearly, you know, Kushner is on a certain side of the spectrum, if you will, when it comes to gaming or you know, the way people should live their lives, etc. And it does make me wonder, will that bleed over into the games that EA will release in the future, as well as the Saudi Arabia approach? You know, just I think I saw on Instagram, and this was like a few weeks ago, I think this was 1 week ago, where Saudi women can now choose their own clothing without male permission. Says the Crown Prince, you know, and this was a week ago. So it just makes me wonder, you know, what kind of political or cultural influences we'll see on games that come out of EA going forward. And I'm also very curious to see if the crowd that always screams woke at other games are going to be saying the same thing about these games. But we'll see. Nothing may change. It might just be, well, I mean, I know things are going to change. You don't just buy something for $55 billion and leave it the same. Obviously, you're going to want to see certain things done. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see what those things are. I think for now, we have about a year or so of probably the same old, same old. I know the Sims community is concerned because of I guess, how the way Saudi women live their lives right now and how that might influence their games going forward. You know, I've been seeing a lot of people who are really against this, and I kind of don't blame them, because this is the first time ever, as far as I can remember, this is the first time ever that a large gaming company, and things have changed quite a bit since gaming has truly started, if we're being fair, but this is the first time where a gaming company is being managed or owned by people who are not into gaming. And technically speaking, again, I know Activision is a great example of a game. You know, it started off as a gaming thing, and we saw how great Call of Duty was, and then how it slowly has kind of spiraled downhill as it's become a more business-oriented mindset where they're thinking about money and not the players. So you can only imagine how this is going to turn out as people who are not super invested in gaming are taking over a gaming company. And will that follow suit? Because there's no shortage of money from the elites. So, I mean, in theory, we could start to see more of these companies get bought out. So it's just a very, very interesting scenario that we're in. Not exactly the most optimistic of things. You know, we're having a lot of precedents being set pretty quickly that are not good. You know, you look at the Nintendo, the $100 for a game. You look at the patent stuff that's happening. Now whole companies are being bought out. You know, it's like, you know, the gaming space, I wouldn't say it's being cannibalized, but it seems like it's kind of starting to get picked apart in a really negative way. So I'd love to hear your thoughts if you made it this far. Like, sub, comment, all that good stuff. I'd really appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Y'all stay safe. Peace.